to come in and do the equivalent of a forest fire to clear out all the dead wood so that the forest itself can be rejuvenated and society can then move forward. And there's a lot of these periods where the historians of the past will portray these figures who come in and do horrific things as creating an almost service for mankind, right? Creating the foundations for a new world that will be better than the old one. And it's a recurring theme. And so this was the sub-theme of the Khans podcast, because otherwise you don't need me to tell you the story of the Mongols, but I'm going to bring up the historical arsonist element. But this gets to how the Khan has been portrayed, right? If you want to say, oh yes, he cleared out the deadwood and made well, then it's a positive thing. If you say, my family was in the forest fire that he set, you're not going to see it that way. Much of what Genghis Khan is credited with on the upside, right? So things like religious toleration. And you'll say, well, he was the Mongols were religiously tolerant. And so this makes them almost like a liberal reformer kind of thing. But this needs to be seen within the context of their empire, which was very much like the Roman viewpoint, which is the Romans didn't care at a lot of the time what your local people worshipped. They wanted stability. And if that kept stability and kept you paying taxes and didn't require the legionaries to come in and then they didn't care, right? And the Khans were the same way. Like, they don't care what you're practicing as long as it doesn't disrupt their empire and cause them trouble. But what I always like to point out is, yes, but the Khan could still come in with his representatives to your town, decide your daughter was a beautiful woman that they wanted in the Khan's concubine, and they would take them. So how liberal an empire is this, right? So many of the things that they get credit for as though they're some kind of nice guys may, in another way of looking at it, just be a simple mechanism of control, right? A way to keep the empire stable. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They have decided that this is the best. And I love, because the Mongols were what we would call a pagan people now, I love the fact that and I think we called it, I forgot the term we used. It had to do with like they were hedging their bets religiously, right? They didn't know which god was the right one. So as long as you're all praying for the health of the Khan, we're maximizing the chances that whoever the gods are, they get the message, right? So I think it's been portrayed as something like a liberal empire. And the idea of Mongol universality is more about conquering the world. And it's like saying, we're going to bring stability to the world by conquering it. Well, what if that's Hitler, right? He could make the same case. Or Hitler wasn't really the world conqueror like that, because he wouldn't have been trying to make it equal for all peoples. But my point being that it kind of takes the positive moral slant out of it if their motivation wasn't a positive moral slant to the motivation. And the Mongols didn't see it that way. And I think the way that it's portrayed is like, and I always like to use this analogy, but it's like shooting an arrow and painting a bullseye around it afterwards, right? How do we justify and make them look good in a way that they themselves probably, and listen, we don't have the Mongol point of view per se. I mean, there's something called The Secret History of the Mongols, and there's things written down by Mongolian overlords through people like Persian and Chinese scribes later. We don't have their point of view, but it sure doesn't look like this was an attempt to create some wonderful place where everybody was living a better life than they were before. I think that's later people putting a nice rosy spin on it.
So, but there's an aspect to it, maybe you can correct me, because I'm projecting sort of my idea of what it would take to conquer so much land, is the ideology is emergent. So if I were to guess, the Mongols started out as exceptionally, as warriors who valued excellence in skill of killing, not even killing, but like the actual practice of war. And it can start out small and it can grow and grow and grow. And then in order to maintain the stability of the things over which, of the conquered lands, you developed a set of ideas with which you can, like you said, establish control. But it was emergent. And it seems like the core first principle idea of the Mongols is just to be excellent warriors. That felt to me like the starting point. It wasn't some ideology. Like with Hitler and Stalin, with Hitler, there was an ideology that didn't have anything to do with war underneath it. It was more about conquering. It feels like the Mongols started out more organically. I would say it's like this phenomenon started emergently, and they were just like similar to the Native Americans with the Comanches, like the different warrior tribes that Joe Rogan's currently obsessed with. That led me to look into it more. They seem to just start out just valuing the skill of fighting, whatever the tools of war they had, which were pretty primitive, but just to be the best warriors they could possibly be, make a science out of it. Is that crazy to think that there was no ideology behind it in the beginning?
I'm going to back up a second. I'm reminded of the line said about the Romans that they create a wasteland and call it peace. That is
Wow.
that, but there's a lot of conquerors like that, right? Yeah. Where you will sit there and listen. Historians forever have it's the famous trade-offs of empire, and they'll say, well, look at the trade that they facilitated, and look at the religion, all those kinds of things, but they come at the cost of all those peoples that they conquered forcibly and by force integrated into their empire. The one thing we need to remember about the Mongols that makes them different than, say, the Romans, and this is complex stuff and way above my pay grade, but I'm fascinated with it, and it's more like the Comanches that you just brought up, is that the Mongols are not a settled society. Okay, they come from a nomadic tradition. Now, several generations later, when you have Kublai Khan as the emperor of China, it's beginning to be a different thing, right? And the Mongols, when their empire broke up, the ones that were in the so-called settled societies, right, Iran, places like that, they will become more like over time the rulers of those places were traditionally. And the Mongols in, say, like the Khaganate of the Golden Horde, which is still in their traditional nomadic territories, will remain traditionally more Mongol. But when you start talking about who the Mongols were, I try to make a distinction. They're not some really super special people. They're just the latest confederacy in an area that saw nomadic confederacies going back to the beginning of recorded history. The Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Avars, the Huns, the Magyars. I mean, these are all the nomadic, the nomads of the Eurasian steppe were huge, huge players in the history of the world until gunpowder nullified their traditional weapon system, which I've been fascinated with because their traditional weapon system is not one you could copy. Because you were talking about being the greatest warriors you could be. Every warrior society I've ever seen values that. What the nomads had of the Eurasian steppe was this relationship between human beings and animals that changed the equation. It was how they rode horses. And societies like the Byzantines, which would form one flank of the steppe, and then all the way on the other side you had China, and below that you had Persia. These societies would all attempt to create mounted horsemen who used archery. And they did a good job, but they were never the equals of the nomads because those people were literally raised in the saddle. They compared them to centaurs. The Comanches, great example, considered to be the best horse riding warriors in North America. The Comanches, I always loved watching, there's paintings. George Catlin, the famous painter who painted the Comanches, illustrated it, but the Mongols and the Scythians and the Avars and all these people did it too, where they would shoot from underneath the horse's neck, hiding behind the horse the whole way. You look at a picture of somebody doing that, and it's insane. This is what the Byzantines couldn't do, and the Chinese couldn't do. And it was a different level of harnessing a human-animal relationship that gave them a military advantage that could not be copied, right? It could be emulated, but they were never as good, right? That's why they always hired these people. They hired mercenaries from these areas because they were incomparable, right? It's the combination of people who were shooting bows and arrows from the time they were toddlers, who were riding from the time they were who rode all the time. I mean, the Huns were bow-legged, the Romans said, because they were never out. They ate, slept, everything in the saddle. That creates something that is difficult to copy. And it gave them a military advantage I enjoy reading actually about when that military